Whilst most Spec Evo usually depends on the absence of humans, for either its world or narrative or both, one or two rising tropes are actually dependent on our existence to function. One to recently emerge being the notion of a human predator, something specialised to some degree in hunting mankind. So as ever, let's delve into the nitty-gritty of the natural world to see how much water this notion can hold. It's worth noting right away that a lot of traditional stories of man-eating can be dismissed to some degree here. Those represent individuals that took to hunting humans, usually due to poor condition or injury, and so don't represent a good baseline to build a specialised hominid predator from. However, semi-regular fatalities from large predators does still occur in the global south, where human-wildlife conflict can be both intense and very dangerous for both parties. In areas of Tanzania surrounding Nyerere National Park, lions will view humans as prey, and occasionally attack at night, even as people rest inside their homes. This stems from a lack of natural prey in the surrounding area for the most part, but also the remaining wild prey of bush pigs preferring farmed areas for the crops, which in turn brings the lions into the area too. Lions will then attack farmers trying to protect their crops from bush pigs, as well as opportunistic ambushes around night and dawn and dusk, as people have to go about their daily lives with lions in the area. It does seem that the severity of the attacks is at least partly caused by bush pig influence, and one valid man-eater story may also support this as well. Their famous Ghost in the Darkness took to killing railway workers due to a notable lack of wild prey in the area, albeit without needing a similar species to lure them in. So if there is a chief reason for something to start speccing into man-eating professionally, it mainly is an absence of other viable prey. But with that sorted, is there a certain set of skills that make something an especially good man-eater? Or a special set of skills one needs to take higher primates? As a lot of this does deal more with modern post-agricultural people, and a lot of examples of this trope are usually envisioned more with Neolithic or generally pre-agricultural people. We can use other large primates as a rough analogue for pre-agricultural humans, as humans are still primates, and in very broad strokes have similar needs, strengths, and some similar behaviours, when not based by agriculture. Baboons in particular have been used as hominin analogues in the scientific literature for both general and specific topics, including predation. And if something is to evolve as a specialist man-eater, surely it needs to start by eating primates or at least hominids. Cave fossils from South Africa, where assorted primates made up almost half of the predated remains, show that when predators took baboons, they also took hominids too. So learning to take one does seem to correlate with taking the other as well. So whilst things are of course quite a bit different between people and wilder primates, there's also not much in the literature asking about the potency of man-eaters over the root causes, so we'll have to take what we can get. A big thing that would be good right away is being nocturnal. Humans have pretty good vision, and decent colour vision too, but some of the worst night vision of any mammal, and with mediocre other senses to make up for that. In a fair amount of cases, predators like leopards will attack dangerous primates like baboons or gorillas by a nocturnal ambush, to bypass the security the group adds. And it is worth noting how comparatively helpless primates, and by extension humans, would be in such a scenario too. Records show leopards spending whole nights in the same tree as a baboon troop, with them essentially powerless to get rid of it, a far cry from how they're treated in daylight. Similarly, leopards will also kill even silverback male gorillas, around twice their size at least, in nighttime ambushes. So the popular notion of such species being towering hulks doesn't necessarily have to be true, and rather they could be around half the size of people instead. Generally, whatever the species does, it's going to want to avoid group retaliation. This is a bit of a thing with the more dangerous primates, and would be a thing with humans at any point in our history. If it wants to hunt in daylight, it really needs to be a smash and grab or a silent abduction. Baboons, when usually taken outside of night ambushes, are the males, who forage more on the periphery of the group, or undergo dispersal alone. Forget any notion of isolating successfully. That's generally a horror film trope. Cavemen weren't stupid or naive, and in reality it'd be a lot more "grug, get the atlatl," instead of "I'll go and investigate this blatant predator presence myself." Because it can't be stressed enough how any species doing this won't be able to handle a whole group of people. In the Pleistocene, we were killing the largest land mammal alive at the time with sticks and rocks. The notion of something else withstanding that is untenable. And if it is that ridiculously powerful or fast or well armed or etc., why is it messing around with bony people instead of hunting the straight-tusked elephants itself? The strength of shelter can often be enough to dissuade predation just by giving a sufficiently strong home. So in theory, if you can make something agile and dexterous enough it can get itself in and a human out, bully for you. Though this may not be the only way to do it, of course. And again, if you have something strong enough to punch down walls, why is it not punching down elk instead? But on the shelter notion, it does bring up another point of where in time your man-eater is. Obviously, the most popular route is around the Pleistocene, with anatomically modern humans having evolved, but being pre-agriculture. But a touch further back could be better. It is unusual we have only one species of hominid on the planet right now. That's us, by the way. And prior epochs often had several. Most recently, and some of the best known, are of course the Neanderthals and Denisovians. And of course, the human predator should really be a hominid predator, only having specified humans as we're the only ones left. The more hominids there are for it, the more sense it'd make. However, existing estimates of how many humans were alive at the time don't do you any favours here, with upper conservative estimates of cavemen in Western Europe being 25,000 for the entire region, significantly less than most small European cities today. The paper doesn't state if this is all hominids or just Homo sapiens, but either way this is an uphill struggle clearly. Many later hominids were top-order predators though, and even in megafaunally rich times may have had questionable abundance to support such superpredation. Whatever your species is doing, it's going to need a fallback prey item that you can justify it not swapping to entirely. Because I think there are two ways you can view the route to a human predator chronologically. Either a Cenozoic species that evolved alongside hominids specialising into eating them, which is the more common one that has been discussed so far for the most part, or an Anthropocene/post-Anthropocene species that arose after some form of societal collapse, when the world could essentially be described as post-apocalyptic, which the points made so far can still apply to. And despite needing a literal apocalypse, I do think they're about as likely as each other, or have similarly large setbacks. In a fictional world, the Anthropocene is the more likely option, simply as even in a post-apocalypse, the human biomass on the planet will likely be higher than at any point in its pre-agricultural history. Even after some disaster that reduces humanity to 10% of its former population, that'll still probably be orders of magnitude higher than the highest collected hominid population of the Pleistocene. Thus, your species is going to have a good enough evolutionary prompt to start specialising into them. There is then the fly in the ointment of how long it would take such a specialist to evolve, no matter the family it came from, and what exactly humanity is doing in that time, that it didn't manage to rebuild civilization to some degree that predation is no longer a leading cause of mortality. But it's also your apocalypse to make. Maybe it's a mutant or feral bioweapon or some such. Either way, if you ask me, fiction can patch up that particular error a lot easier than it can the sheer lack of pre-agricultural humans on a prey landscape. So to sum up so far, the ideal homemade human hunter is going to want to be nocturnal first, and have some degree of stealth too, in case it needs a daytime snack. And that could also theoretically help it raid shelters as well. And we can already see just how little specialism you'd need to start eating people. Real predators didn't eat people because we were skilled predators ourselves, knowledgeable, and not at all that numerous. Not because past predators were too inept or lacking some mysterious secret skill or trait. So on a similar note, on the scale of realism to fantasy that all Spec Evo slides up and down depending on various factors, it's just much more likely for an already existing predator species to behaviourally spec into human specialism than it is for another one to morphologically adapt into human specialism instead. As with the ghost in the darkness, it can be fairly said they were healthy human specialists, and it can occur with other dangerous primates too. For more examples, one reserve in the Waterberg found its leopards were taking unusually high amounts of chacma baboon, to the point where they could potentially be considered specialists, with one subadult female being good enough to take adult males in broad daylight attacks. Whatever trick she learned, she was damn good at it. This isn't limited to cats either. Hyenas are somewhat atypical in man-eating, in that it's usually opportunism rather than being compromised in some way. And spotted hyenas are also with leopards and Meganterion. In the Pleistocene man-eaters of Swarkrons, hyenas have shown ability to opportunistically take baboons, and also show no prey preference either. They just eat the most common large prey item in the area, and if that's humans, then so be it. And in some cases, otherwise healthy wolves will take to man-eating as well. Indian wolves will quite regularly take children, and are often topping the lists in human-wildlife conflict mortality. African painted wolves haven't sullied their wild record for man-eating, but have been recorded to become primate specialists on the dangerous chacma baboon. So with the apocalypse route, it's hard to imagine such a weirdly precise scenario, that it destroys civilization, but while keeping good amounts of humans, and while inexplicably leaving the natural world untouched, or at least not in a worse state than we currently have it. Should there be some survivors though, there doesn't really need to be much changes as said. Such changes are much more likely to be behavioural. Pick any large carnivore really, and you can shape it into a behavioural man-eater specialist solely due to a lack of other prey. So whilst a less fun option, it does at least give you options. In theory you could then take things from there, and add some physical adaptations more for a creature design point of view as well. In the event of some form of apocalypse that partially scrubs the natural world, there is still a potential candidate that's often missed in this regard, previously discussed to some degree before in these videos, and that's dogs. Good and bad dogs are a staple of post-apocalyptia, from Fallout's loyal dog meat to the slavering wasteland hounds, as well as the various media that inspired Neo-Fallout, like Mad Max and A Boy and His Dog, and the more recent films like I Am Legend's Infected Dogs, with literature like both the feral packs that established in the lower 48 in the zombified world of World War Z, and the dog teams used to fight the undead as well, and similarly most recently the anti-infected dogs used in the siege of Jackson Hole in The Last of Us. Any apocalypse keeping humans is probably keeping dogs. And dogs will actually turn predatory a lot faster than people think. Some studies show dogs may actually turn to man-eating essentially near instantly. In the late 90s Newfoundland, it was apparently common practice to keep sled dogs on uninhabited islands in between runs. And in one case, a pack of Labrador Huskies killed and mostly ate 2 people when they went for a day out berry picking on the island. This was despite the dogs being in good condition, and allegedly being fed the day before, with the belief poor socialization and the encouragement of group hunting, feeding, and territoriality all contributing to such attacks, with initial conclusions coming from reports of such attacks in the lower 48 too, where feral packs had also been reported to opportunistically predate humans. So again, bear in mind all of this is still the 21st century, and not a post-apocalypse with dogs that had hunted other prey to some degree. In a barren wasteland where humans are one of, or perhaps the most common or even only large mammal on the landscape, true human specialist packs could well form, and form quite quickly as well. In the feral video I mentioned dogs can often fare poorly without humans, as Western breeds often, but not always, start out with poor predatory aptitude that results in low survival in the wild. But similarly, sedentary humans are probably a lot easier to catch than ungulates, so one could even suggest this may put human-eating feral dogs in something of an evolutionary ratchet if they start specializing in humans. There are a few other points going for this idea as well. Dogs, of course, will likely start off in close proximity to people, as a domestic species, and are very enduring animals themselves too, but with far greater speed, that will help in both facilitating their own predation and resisting retaliation. They can also function nocturnally, and whilst not as good at surprise as cats, the pack hunting can mitigate any resistance when they isolate a target. Cats were used as examples earlier. and most examples of these tropes are solitary, but there's no real reason a human hunter can't be a pack hunter too. A fanciful point one could play with is just how well dogs know people as well. Domestication isn't just physical changes, it's mental and behavioural ones too. The process does rewire the brain to some degree, and years of selective breeding means dogs can intuit a lot of human behaviours and gestures. This is theoretically something that can be turned against us when we stop being friends and become food instead. Now we reach the portion of the video where one has to deal with the zenith of this trope, the human mimic. To take it from the top, the well-known phenomenon of the uncanny valley exists, where humans find things that are close to humans but not quite, unsettling to look at. This observation actually stems from designing robots, over any psychological study, though it has been analysed as such since, with reasons presented for this including natural avoidance of corpses, diseased or deformed humans, or general avoidance of the other. But it has been speculated many times it's to avoid something that is quite close to human but not. As such, there have been several attempts of people to create various creatures of dubious origin that have either weirdly human faces or mock human faces to argue this was man's natural predator and the cause of the uncanny valley effect. As well as these very often having examples of Rube Goldberg predation, I think this trope falls apart on a few levels, but most prevalently as it's just a big misunderstanding of how anatomically modern humans would behave in a wild environment. The notion they'd see a disembodied uncanny face 7 feet in the air in a dark forest at dusk, and think this was something worth checking out alone with no atlatl and without telling Gruggung and Gunga, simply doesn't fly. And again, if there are multiple people, it's getting atlatled to death. And if it's deadly enough to withstand or dodge that assault, again, why is it eating low-calorie humans when it's that strong? There are multiple versions of this you can find, all with their own basket of issues it'll benefit no one for me to pick apart. But I think that is the chiefest and greatest issue. It relies on people who live alongside Smilodon and Arctodus, and who haven't died yet, to suddenly start acting like the first fornicating jock and bimbo in a Freddy or Jason film. Because the horror film comparison isn't unjust. As for its budding insistence in Spec Evo over the past year or so, it's really not that uncommon a trope overall. After all, what is a vampire if not just this trope, but less bestial and with a dietary fixation on blood? Or indeed, sirens and mermaids. Making a bestial human mimic is ultimately destined to fall a bit flat if you think about it too much, or indeed at all. But the better the mimic gets, the more I think you can actually argue for its realism. And it's not that this necessarily stops being Spec Evo, but the creature design aspect that's half the fun of Spec Evo diminishes notably, and you'd feel like you are writing a horror fantasy or sci-fi instead. Because a mimic that actually works is essentially just a human, until it unveils its party trick and uses whatever method it uses to eat its unsuspecting victim. But humans can still often be xenophobic or generally hostile, and pre-agricultural humans could be too, with occasional bouts of warfare. It's still an uphill struggle to convince a human you've somehow managed to isolate, you're just a chill guy, especially when you're not actually human and your intentions are far from chill indeed. The notion of implying far from chill implications can be a point in their favour though. A great many human mimic monsters in myth and legend are very often hot. And earlier I talked about certain demographics being more vulnerable or selected than others. If there's any demographic you'd successfully be able to lure away from a group, thirsty adolescent males would take the least convincing. Again, this is far from unusual, and it's a pretty common trope in horror and myth too, being another example of where this notion is probably best used. But it is interesting that this has some backbone in the natural world too. Sexual mimicry is pretty common both overall and in predation, albeit among less cognitively developed species. And in theory, the only thing stopping a species doing so with people is just how good a mimic they are. Humans uniquely crap other senses, and especially smell, could potentially predispose them to blindness of such warning signs that may alert other mammals, and the ability to rationalize, and then rationalize with the mind of a thirsty adolescent male, could well result in desire overpowering actual reason, or instinct, as the species wants. Potential goonery aside, I think it is sincerely interesting when you actually consider pre-agricultural beauty standards, and how they differ so greatly among different cultures and regions. The species in question would almost have to have something more akin to a brood parasite, with races or gens specializing in certain cultures only, and then failing should they try it with someone else. The 1-2 punch of colonialization, and then its technical metamorphosis into globalization, presumably having pretty negative consequences on a great many gens. Whether they'd still persist today is creator's choice, and what the internet would do for such gens is similarly anyone's guess. Luckily the channel is doing well enough I don't need to make an OnlyFans too, so you can do your own market research there. If it uses vocal mimicry, then again there is some precedent for this, as predators have actually been seen to mimic primate prey to some degree of attraction. However, humans are a bit of a stickler in this regard, as a random repeated and regurgitated phrase coming from the woods at night is not a recipe for attraction. If it would be anything, a crying baby would be the most likely one. Yes, I'm aware that's a pretty common trope too, but then it is the closest one to being effective you really have. All in all, I think it's a sincerely fun and effective horror trope, but one that can often have questionable relevance in Spec Evo. Human specialists are a fun notion, and the looks like a human but isn't one can and regularly has been used in excellent horror. But I think one of the biggest things I really notice with many examples of this is just how much they exist in a vacuum. The Pleistocene was one of the most megafaunally rich periods of the Cenozoic. What is Captain Killerface doing if it searches a cave for humans and finds a cave bear or lion instead? Do other predators and prey lead it to preferring forest or steppes? How does it breed or interact with its own kind too, for that matter? Hell if I know, as every example is essentially a creepypasta or SCP, with some vague zoological jargon rather than something that's like a field guide entry. Hence why I do think it's worth bringing up if this trope has legs anywhere, it's in a post-apocalypse. Here you can be the architect of who survives how much of what, and generally fill it with all the ferals, mutants and weirdos you want. Less grounded, and more pulpy for sure, but you're also creating a world with a human specialist in it. Take what you can get. Human specialists are frequently built in isolation, rather than as part of an established world, and I don't necessarily disagree with that. Unless one of the more animalistic versions suggested, I think they work much better in creative horror short stories, rather than in long-running or expansive world-building media that is meant to be chewed and mulled over for long periods. You should rather start with fantasy and sci-fi, and sprinkle some Spec Evo into the ideas, over trying to develop them fully as their own spec project, perhaps. I think the ideal outing for them is something like an episode of Doctor Who, or Tales from the Crypt, or something by Bad Space Comics, or maybe a short video game or something. And so the caveman setting doesn't necessarily have to be abandoned here either. I, for one, really like the idea of derived predatory hominids that ate chiefly other hominids, with an element of tragedy too, in the fact that as other hominids went extinct and humans got too canny to prey on, they're on their last legs by the end of the Pleistocene as well. Unfeasible and pulpy as that is. But after all, I'm only human. Thanks for watching. And thanks as ever to my patrons: Bonecrusher Hyena, Toxic Wolf, The Superest Duper, DJ, Samburgo, K. Sandom, Octavia of the Fifth Fleet, Nickname 3110, Kieran McCarthy, Flygon's Archives, Hui Hui, Jabin, Phenomenon, The Belted Horned Warbler, Big Man Blastoise, Nathan Cross, Johnny, Oni, Tim Kojira, Teddy KGB, Waffle, Slashmaster 101, Dapperaptor, Aristocrat Mojo, Godzilla Prime 2, Original Username, Small Squid, Litton Gamer 111, Evilly, Howleth, Archosaur Queen, Tommy Choi, Jacob Wilcox, Seth Fake Last Name, Dodecablos, and Bazugazu Bakuratsu Bakumatsu, who help keep the channel going with their generosity. If you're interested in supporting too, a link is added in the description, and any amount is always appreciated. Thanks too to Rita Critter for creating the human mimic artwork for the video, and they did an excellent job with how broad the brief was. For more of their artwork, you can follow them on their assorted social media linked in the description, and if you'd like your own pieces commissioned, a link to their site is added as well. And thanks too to Vogel for their evil man-eater example they made for the video as well. Even if it didn't get used for the video, it can still live on in the thumbnail. And yes, I'm aware I didn't talk about any birds of prey, despite using one in the thumbnail. Vogel made it before I specified the brief for the artwork, so I had to put it somewhere, didn't I? There are records of large eagles attacking people, of course, and they're natural predators of primates. However, I didn't want to turn it into a laundry list of everyone who could eat people. As with Spec, you can essentially give anyone that role. This was more to look into sincerely likely candidates, and what may cause such things to arise. Crocodiles are another one, but I'm not sure that counts as a real specialization so much as crocodiles just eating people because they're there. Any croc large enough is a potential man-eater in that regard. I did also look into other primates a lot more too, and deleted and rewrote a paragraph on them several times before finding it just too much of a reach. Chimps are famously potent hunters of monkeys, and have actually recently been seen to scale their ambitions higher to young gorillas too. They're also dexterous and mobile as well, enough so that they could presumably enter early shelters, or post-apocalypse ruined buildings. And the idea of man-eating primates is an interesting one, but ultimately the fact they have to evolve a much more predatory nature first, and a lot of larger and/or predatory primates are so range and environment limited, it felt hard to justify. This is an unusual video for me, I admit, but I'd seen enough instances of the mimic trope especially, and had discussed them a lot with others, to the point where I thought it could be a potentially decent video. I do also like the horror genre, especially reading it, and this was as close as I was going to get to actually talking about some aspects of it too. As ever, if you have ideas for future subjects for these videos to look into, please do suggest them in the comments below. I have a fair few Spec Evo shorts lined up, but more is never a bad thing. One of them will also be giant bug centric, as the flight video was fairly criticised for leaving invertebrates out, and I'm just mulling over which angle to approach it from. Hopefully I'll see you there for it, and for the next non-Monster Hunter video too.